Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from some of those who were directly involved in the fire and the events which occurred immediately after it. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call Mr. Nabil Choucair, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Choucair.
Morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath. There should be a Quran there for your use. Yes. Would you take it in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please?
I swear by Allah that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable,
Thank
please?
you.
Yes, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Choucair, good morning. May I start by thanking you very much for coming here to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We're extremely grateful to you. By way of introduction, can I ask you please to keep your voice up so that the person who sits to your right and is typing can get down on the transcript your evidence clearly. Please also don't shake your head or nod your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case
Sure,
may
no
be.
problem.
Okay. Now, if any of my questions are unclear or you'd like me to repeat them or put them in a different way, I can do that.
Okay.
And as you probably know, we'll take a break halfway through the morning just so that everybody can get a break. But if you need a break at any other time, we can do that too. Now, you've made two statements to the inquiry. The first is at IWS 401069. Can we please have that up on the screen? That's dated the 11th of September 2018. And is that the first page of your first statement there?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Can we please turn to page 8? There's a signature there under the statement of truth. Is that your signature?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Can we please turn to your second statement? That's at IWS 402365. Is that the first page of your second statement there?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Can we please turn to page 8 in that statement? And you'll see there's a statement of truth in the middle of the screen with a signature underneath it above the date, 28th of February 19. Is that your signature?
It is, but I just want to say I think the date of the years should be 20 rather than 19.
Yes, thank you. I was going to ask you that. So that should be 2020. Have you had the opportunity to read both of these statements that I've just shown you recently?
I have, yes.
And can you confirm that the contents of each of these statements are true?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you one or two questions first, if I may, Mr. Choucair, about your connection with Grenfell Tower. You had a strong connection with the building, didn't you? Because a number of your family members lived there. Is that right?
That's correct.
And just to identify them, am I right that it was your sister Nadia and her husband Bassem who lived at flat 193, yes?
That's correct.
And they had 3 children,
Yes,
your
that's
nieces
correct.
Miana, Fatima and Zainab, yes?
That's correct.
Yes. And your mother, Syria,
Yes.
lived at 191 with your other sister, Solsan.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, you gave a commemoration to the inquiry on the 22nd of May 2018 for your family. And you explained to us at that stage and to everybody listening the experience that you endured as a result, and are still enduring, as a result of what's happened to your family. And I want to make sure that we all bear that in mind when you're giving your evidence.
That's correct.
But you'll recall that.
I do, yes.
I want just to ask you about the night of the fire. I think it's right, and correct me if this isn't right, that you became aware of the fire first when your sister, Sorson, telephoned you on the night of the 14th of June.
That's correct, yes.
And I say on the night, in the early hours.
In the early hours, that's right.
And that was, I think you tell us, between 2:30 and 2:40 a.m. That's what you say in your first statement of paragraph 17. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you also say in the next paragraph, let's have that up actually, it's page 5 of the first statement, paragraph 18. Paragraph 18, page 5. You say, I tried phoning Nadia, but the phone just kept ringing and ringing. That's right, is it?
That's correct, yeah.
And then I think you say you called your brother, Hissam, to tell him what had happened and to meet me at the tower.
That's right.
Yeah. And I told Malak to keep trying Nadia and her brother Basim, you say there.
Basim, yeah.
Should that be Bassem or Basim?
Basim,
who were inside the tower, and then I left home and left Nadia with our 3 children at home.
That's correct.
Now, you then arrived at the tower. You say, I rushed down to the tower. Coincidentally, both my brother Hissam and I both arrived at about the same point in time, and I parked under the Westway Sports Centre. Can you tell us a little bit about the scene you observed when you arrived?
There was a cordon, the road had been cordoned off. Ambulance was going and coming, fire brigade was going and coming. It was like chaos. The tower was ablaze. It was just the worst nightmare you could ever imagine and see.
And where on the cordon were you? Which part of the cordon did you arrive at?
I arrived at, it was on Bramley Road. I think it was at the junction of Solon Road or something.
Right. And you could see the tower clearly from there, could you?
I could see the tower, yeah.
Did you see anyone when you arrived from RBKC or the TMO?
No, I did not.
And what was going through your mind when you arrived at the cordon and could see the building and were trying to find your family?
I was hoping that my family and everybody had made it out and nobody was in the tower.
Now, can we go to your second statement, please? I just want to ask you about your search in the early hours of that morning. If we go to page 4 of your second statement, please, paragraph 20. Second statement, that's IWS 402365, page 4. And at paragraph 20, you have a little heading which says rest centres, and then you say, my brother Hissam and I learnt that some of the local halls were being opened up for displaced residents. This was around the early hours of the morning, roughly 5 to 6 a.m. of the 14th. My brother and I separated to search these centres. We kept hearing from people on the streets, others looking for their loved ones, that these centres were opening up for the residents that had been evacuated from the tower. So is this right, that between you and your brother and sister, Hissam and Sorson, you in all, I think, searched some 6 rest centres looking for your family?
That's correct.
Right. And is it right that you were hearing about those rest centres from other people in the street?
From around, yes, that's correct, yeah.
So do I take it from that you weren't getting any information about which these rest centres were or where they were from any official source?
No, just from people looking for their loved ones and missing one people,
Right. And at that time, did you understand that those rest centres were official rest centres or community-led?
We didn't know whether they were community-led or they were official. We just knew that they were being opened up for people to be taken there.
And how easy was it to identify and access these rest centres?
You could access them, but getting information was, it was ask and wait kind of thing. but it was all panic all over, and there was a lot of uncertainty.
Right. And when you say uncertainty, was that because you weren't sure whether to trust what people in the street were telling you?
We didn't know where and what time the places were open, or whether the families would be in there or not.
Right. And if we go to page 5 of your second statement, the next page, paragraph 27, you say this under the heading Response from the Authorities at the foot of the screen there. You say, rest centres, the response was a mess, even within the rest centres. 1 minute someone was there, the next minute everyone was gone. As explained above, there was a lack of coordination, and the rest centres were often unmanned. I do not recall whether there were any officials from RBKC or central government. We were just looking for our loved one. There was so much confusion and no arrangements or control of anything. Nobody knew who was where. Is that right? You can confirm that here.
Yes, that's correct.
Were you aware of something called a Friends and Family Assistance Centre having been set up?
No.
Or some kind of centre to provide information for people like you looking for their loved ones? No?
No.
Were members of the community, is this how it worked, essentially pulling together in these rest centres trying to offer support?
It was just chaos. It was just a lot of chaos, as far as I remember.
When you got to these rest centres, did you find them helpful in providing information about where your loved ones might be, or giving you support in any way?
There wasn't very much help. I mean, it was a lot of confusion, and it was a lot of chaos going on the day, morning, shall I say.
If we go back a page in your second statement to paragraph 23 on page 4, you say there, we pick it up at the beginning of paragraph 23, the foot of page 4, you say, the search for our loved ones. After checking the centres and registering the names at the centre on the morning of the 14th of June, I decided we should go to check the hospitals in case my family had been taken there. And then you go on to describe you and Hissam's journey through London, checking each of these hospitals. Why did you feel at the time that you had to search for your family from hospital to hospital?
I thought just in case they had made it out, or they had been rescued, maybe we might be able to find them in a hospital or so. So there was a chance, since we had searched everywhere else and there was no luck anywhere else, we thought, maybe that's the next step we might be lucky to find, or hope to find.
Right. And did you observe anybody at the rest centres getting any help about the way to go about finding their loved ones who weren't there?
Well, we noticed people were. It was chaos. I mean, they could only help with what they had, or they knew who was there, if it was helpful to them. But it was just, as I say, a lot of chaos, and it was a lot of panic. It was a lot of nobody knew what was going on, what was happening, and confusion and everything else.
Now, you say in paragraphs 16 and 17 of this statement, and if we go back a page, we can see them on the screen. There they are. In those two paragraphs, you say that while searching hospitals, you called an emergency helpline during the course of the morning of the 14th of June. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you say that you learnt about that number between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m., and you tried it, and I think eventually got through at about 8:30. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Can you just tell us what happened when you got through?
We had to give, they asked for the members' names, who they were, and what they were related to, who they were related to, their ages, the date of birth, and etc.
Right. And did they tell you what they were going to do with that information?
They did not tell us what they was going to do. No. No, I was assuming that they would tell us. Once we gave the information to them, they would come back, or they would tell us that, yeah, we do have your loved ones, or we don't have them, or we haven't, come across them yet, or so.
So were you expecting them to call you back with information?
I did expect them to call me and to notify me and let me know, if they had found our loved ones or not.
Right. Did they say anything to you to lead you to think that they would call you back with useful information?
They did not say nothing, no. It was more like they were taking more information from us, but not giving anything or being helpful in the sense when you really wanted to know what was going on. Have you heard about them? Do you know about them, or have they turned up in your care, or do you have them on your list? That's what we wanted to know, but there was no even that clue.
Did they tell you what the process that they were running was?
They did not mention our process, no.
Did they tell you who was running the service, or was that obvious from the helpline? At first, I assumed that it was, they was taking the information to give us, they would take the information to give us the feedback, about our families. But then it seemed all very clear at the end, that they was just taking information rather than giving information. Yes. And you say 4 lines down in paragraph 18 that they gave you a reference number and said that they would call you back. Did they tell you what the reference number was for?
They said, if you need, it was because it's been logged, you've made the kind of log, the logging kind of thing for what you've just said, and we've taken it, and that's the reference number for it.
And you go on to say, I did not find the service helpful as I don't ever recall anyone calling me back. In fact, it was the opposite. It was frustrating as I kept waiting for an answer, waiting for an update, and none came. I found that it was a number for data collection rather than them phoning back with any feedback as to where my family may have been. How did you discover that it was a number for data collection? Did somebody tell you that, or was that a conclusion that you drew from the fact that nobody called you back?
That was the conclusion I drew, yes, because they didn't call me back. They took the information and they didn't give us anything,
Right. And did they tell you how you could use the reference number that they'd given you?
No.
Now, you say in paragraph 23, if we just scroll down to the foot of page 4 again, we've looked at this a minute ago together, but let's just look at it again. You say, and I'm summarising, tell me if this is wrong, that as you continue to search the hospitals, one of the key issues and problems that you and Hissam, your brother, faced was that hospitals were not providing information because of what they said was confidentiality concerns. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Did they explain those concerns to you at all?
Well, at the time my brother was checking the hospitals, so whether they explained it to him or not, but I mean, we did come across a few that were being very awkward under the, mentioned that under the data protection they wasn't given that, even though it was an emergency and we told them, and we were looking for our families, or he was looking, he mentioned that he was looking for his families.
And if we go to page 5, still within paragraph 23, you say 6 lines down. Can you see that you say there, we kept going around and around? You say we kept going around and around at the hospitals as time progressed into the early evening. In between, we kept phoning them up, but it was the same as before. Some could give us information, and some were reluctant and didn't. That's right, is it?
That's right. Some did give us. Right. Some were very helpful, and some weren't.
Right. And what did you understand? What did you make of the fact that there was this difference in approach between one hospital and another about their willingness to give you information about your loved ones?
It's. I can understand under data protection, but the fact when you have an emergency and that when one is saying something and another is saying another, you should have one rule and one policy throughout. The fact that they were being different and difficult in such an emergency and an assumption of circumstances where this was unforeseen. You're looking for your loved one, you can at least be work with it kind of thing, and be helpful.
Right. Do you remember whether there was any official presence at any of these hospitals, such as officers from the Metropolitan Police or officials from RBKC, providing information to those in your position?
You mean at the cordon? At the
hospitals.
Oh, at the hospital. I didn't ask. I didn't go in to ask in the hospital. It was my brother, so I was making phone calls, trying to find out from other hospitals.
Yes. Now, speaking of phone calls, we have a transcript of a call that you made to the Metropolitan Police on the 14th of June 2017, in which you're trying to find information on your missing family. And I just want to look at the transcript with you, if I may. It's a contemporaneous document, so let's see how we go with it. It's at MET 3014169. And as you can see from the top, it's call 48 with CAD 9827 on the 14th of June 2017. I'm not sure we can time the call any better than that, but perhaps you can help us, Mr. Choucair. It says, operator, Metropolitan Police, how can I help? Hello, Metropolitan Police. And you say, we've got some family visiting inaudible earlier on today and I haven't heard from them. I've searched every hospital and I've called every centre and I still haven't had any feedback from anybody. Could you help me, please? And then, operator, right, sorry, who are you looking for? Caller, my mother and her and my sister and her family. I reported it earlier on. Just a minute. And then, right, to you guys. And what's your name? My name's Nabil Choucair. Okay, this is regarding the potential fire at Grenfell Tower, yeah? Grenfell Tower, yeah, that's correct, yeah, okay. And then you say, I've dialed at the bureau number. I've gone to every, what do you call it, like Salvation Army or all these charity, whatever things they're doing, hostels and all that, and tried every hospital, no luck. Just pausing there, do you remember roughly, and I know it's difficult, just looking at what I've shown you, but do you remember roughly what time you made this call?
I would assume from what I've said, it's after the bureau time of maybe 8:30 or so, I would assume.
Yes. Right.
Because, I made the call to the bureau, the number that was given.
Yes.
So it would only assume that I did it at roughly after that time.
I see. Thank you. And yes, and when you refer to the Salvation Army and other charities and hostels, did you mean the rest centres?
The rest centres,
Yes.
I think.
Yes. Thank you. And about halfway down the page, you say. Just above halfway down the page, the operator says, and what have the casualty bureau said? And caller, they say go and check hospitals. They're not very helpful. I've checked all of the hospitals. Is that right? That the casualty bureau, when you rang them, advised you to check the hospitals yourself?
I think it was, the police is the ones. The bureau was just taking information. The police were saying go and check the hospitals, I believe.
Right. So the police at the rest centres? Or, let me ask you this way. Where were the police, or who were the police advising you to check the hospitals?
No, this is from the phone call of the 999. They was asking, to go and check the hospitals. But we had checked most of them, and the others that were outside, more or less London or so, we'd phoned. I was phoning.
Yes. What I'm just trying to understand is who gave you the advice to check the hospitals?
I would say that it was the police.
Right. And then the operator says...
Sorry, as in the call, the police, or the caller from the police.
Right. So there's the Casualty Bureau, not the Casualty Bureau.
No, the Met Police. This is the call with the police, not the what you call it, not the Met Bureau. No.
Right. Okay. Now, looking a little further down the page, you say, "I've given." Well, the operator says you'll need the Casualty Bureau. They are the people who will take your report. Obviously, if you're concerned that they might have been involved, they'll take as many. And then you say, I've given them my report twice and they still haven't contacted me. Then the operator says, okay, probably the reason for that is there wouldn't be anything to contact you back with at this time. Okay. And what will happen if they locate the potential victims or the people you reported as missing, they will then contact you back. So what I would say is hold fire for the moment. And then the operator goes on. If you spoke to the Casualty Bureau, they're the people who are the ones who are dealing with any sort of casualties, and they're the central call department who are dealing with casualties and the missing people from this incident, okay? And then you give your details again. And then the caller says, the hospitals, after you say Nabil, caller, the inaudible hospitals are closing their lines. Do you remember what you meant by that? Obviously, you were upset at that point, but do you remember what you meant when you were telling this operator that the hospitals were closing their lines?
There was some numbers where I tried calling through, and the lines wasn't ringing. It was literally closed. It was a dead line, and so.
Right. So these are telephone lines?
Telephone lines for the hospitals, yes.
Right, I see. And if we turn to page 2, halfway down the page on page 2, you've given some further details on the first part of that page, and then halfway down, after you can see it says mobile at the top of your screen there, the operator says, so you've spoken to the Casualty Bureau, yeah? And you then say, I have. They said try the hospitals. So it looks as if the Casualty Bureau itself had also told you to try the hospitals, at least looking at this transcript. Would that be right?
If it's saying I can't recall. I can't recall that if they said that, but if it's saying it, I'm assuming yes.
And then the operator says, all right, so you've done that. And then you say, I tried the hospitals, I've tried every single one. Some of them are then putting me straight through to Casualty Bureau. But I've put the Casualty Bureau again. I spoke to hospitals, try again and again, nobody. They take my name, they say they'll contact me. Some take my name and say they contact me. Some say they're not here, I've been trying and trying. I've gone and visited every single one. Okay, more than 12 hospitals in London. All right, and you've left your details with the Casualty Bureau? Yeah, I have, yes. So given that at this point you've visited more than 12 hospitals, would it be right in thinking this is actually sometime a little bit later in the morning on the 14th?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. And then if you go to page 3, Mr. Choucair, of this transcript, about a third of the way down the page, now about just below halfway down your screen, you say, I just wish somebody would inform us more. Maybe they've been taken somewhere else and they haven't been told. Maybe I don't know, they've been allocated by the council. I don't know. There's so much missing. I don't know what to say, It doesn't seem very clear to me, Yeah, I see. Before I start thinking of the inevitable without knowing, and then, if Nabil, as you say, you've spoken to all the hospitals and they haven't got them, then that's going to be our answer. They're not there. And then you say, but they could have brought someone in they were with an oxygen mask and not reported who he is. Unclear, unregistered. I mean, it was just looking at that. Is it right to say that one of the key problems for you on that morning was just the absence of any, not just the absence of any information, but the absence of any information about how to get information about your loved ones?
It was, it was very, very unclear. It was it was so unorganized. It was, you would think in a situation, in an emergency, in a catastrophe, there is some sort of plans, some sort of organization, but it was just, everything was just falling apart. And it was just so unorganized. It was so unhelpful. It was like we were trying forever, but with no help. With no clear sense of help or exactly what we wanted to hear or know.
Yes. And if we turn to page 4 in this transcript. The operator says, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but the operator says, what you've done, Nabil, you've done the right thing. If you've contacted the Casualty Bureau, they've taken your details. They will inform you if they find anyone at hospital or, worst case scenario, deceased at the block. They will contact you, and then they will guide you in the process of what will happen next regarding the potential identification of whether they're at the hospital or at the scene, okay? And you say, right, okay, no problem, all right, that's fine. Operator, okay, Nabil, obviously I'm really sorry. Yeah, obviously it's been a very troublesome time. And then something from you, which is inaudible, and then the operator says, I can't even begin to understand how you must be going through, but please be assured that there are processes in place which we are trying to follow, and I do apologise if it hasn't been explained to you properly, or if you haven't been informed properly. And then the call ends with polite exchanges. But is that right? Does that reflect your experience, that even if there were processes in place, nobody had explained them to you properly or at all?
Even if there was process, it's not the fact that nobody explained them. We wasn't even getting the help or the information that we wanted. It was totally... It was the worst service ever, Everything that could go wrong went wrong. And, it was very unhelpful.
Now, looking ahead from the 14th of June to the few days that followed, I think it's right, isn't it, that your search for your family continued in the week after the fire, yes?
Yes, sorry.
Yes. And if we go to your first statement again, if we can go to that, please. IWS 401069. Let's go to page 7, paragraph 31. And you say there, the preceding days became more and more painful as the reality began to sink in, but we still did not give up hope. Did you get any further information or any help about how to get further information during those days?
No, we were left in the early days, we were left to ourselves to make, to help ourselves and do what we can do, whatever way possible, to try and find whatever we can about our families.
I just want to ask you then about FLOs, Family Liaison Officers. Can we then go to your second statement again, please? And go to page 5, paragraph 25 again. And you say, and this is day 3, 16th of June 2017, we picked up posters and used them on the 16th of June. I gave news interviews with my brother Hissam on that day, and we held the posters up. I think that was the day we spoke to the police and met up with them, 16th/17th June. They said that they had been trying to call us. I don't actually recall where they came to see us. They said they had tried to contact us by telephone, but we weren't available, so they left messages. I checked at the end of the day and noticed that the police had tried to contact me. There were so many missed calls. They explained their role and gave us a brief description of their purpose. I think it was Heather and Ashley. They said that they would tell us everything, do the work, that we would liaise with them, and that they would be there for any help, to update us and to keep informed. We were always phoning them for updates and asking for any news. They said they would be our FLOs and they would keep us informed. They did keep in contact, but only disclosed what they were told to. It seemed the police knew a lot more than what we would be told. I've expanded on this in paragraph 30 below. Now, your brother, in his second witness statement, paragraph 147, I don't need to show it to you, he says that he doesn't remember the FLOs coming to your house in that first week, or the police making contact with him or the family during the week, the first few days after the fire. That's his recollection. Is that the same as your recollection, or do you have a different recollection?
I have a different recollection because I was told they came to visit me at my address, but obviously I think we was doing interviews on the day with news and everything when they had done it.
So are you reasonably confident, looking back on it, that the FLOs did contact you in the first week after the fire?
Within that week, yes. They said they tried, and they did leave messages, yes.
Yes. Did you find the FLOs helpful and responsive to your needs when you did speak to them?
Yes and no. I can elaborate. Do you want
Yes.
to elaborate on
Yes.
that?
Yes, please.
In my statement, they would inform us when they had something, but they wouldn't inform us exactly what. For example, they would tell us, we've come across remains. Now, remains, we did not know what remains was. Was it one body part? Was it many body parts? We tried to understand what is remains, and as I've mentioned in my statement, they came across, they mentioned 6 remains, and we did not know what remains was. Was it 6 body parts, or 6 family members, or 6 what? We tried to find that from them, and they didn't know themselves, and it was a bit of unclarity. There was a confusion. There was, it wasn't very helpful.
And did that process, the discussion about remains, begin with the FLOs during the week after the fire, or was it at a later stage?
I think it was in a later stage. It was a later stage, I believe. As far as I remember, I think it was a later stage.
During the first week after the fire, do you remember whether you had any contact at all with or from RBKC?
After the first week, did you say?
Within the first week?
I don't think so.
What about the TMO? Any contact with them?
Don't think so. As far as no, it was, I think, more to do with flows rather than anything else.
And what about central government?
Not that I remember, no.
Now, you tell us, if we go on, please, to page 7 of this statement, paragraph 32, that you have received bereavement counselling and health and wellbeing therapy. Were you aware of that type of support being available to you during the first week of the fire, after the fire?
I was not aware because we were still looking for our loved ones. That's what we was really concentrating, and that's what we was focused. That was the most and only important thing, that came and was important to us.
Were you aware whether any support like that, psychosocial support, counselling, health and wellbeing therapy, was available generally during that period, the week after the fire?
Not that I recall, no, I wasn't aware, because, as I say, the most important was finding our family.
Do you have any general comments you'd like to tell the panel about the emergency relief response on the part of central government or RBKC or the TMO perhaps in that first week?
It's just how unorganized they was especially on the day of the fire. That when I was trying to find my family and asking about them, and I was pushing to try and get in to rescue them, I was threatened with, if you do that again, you'll be arrested. And I found that at the time so hard and so hurtful, and here I am, here we are, trying to get to our family and rescue them, and we're being threatened with arrest, or there was no help with the fact of, we've got our loved ones maybe in the tower. We just want to know some information. Please just help us. And they wasn't interested. They didn't, well, you know, here we got a sergeant here, we got the commissioner or whoever, you know, is in charge. Come and have a look at him, speak to him, and he'll help you and guide you. There was none of that. You know, it was literally, it was terrible. It was, you know, it was such awful bad service. You know, it was so very unhelpful, and you know, in such a awkward time. You know.
And what, looking back on it, do you think should have been done differently in that immediate aftermath to support you and people like you looking for their loved ones?
There should have been more help. There should have been more help given. There should have been more. It should have been more organised. It should have been more coordinated. It should have been, you know, you've lost a loved one. Come, please step inside. We need to know more about them. Where are they? You know, not just over a phone call. And yeah, you know, there was none of that organisation. We was left to fend for ourselves, left to try and find help, and you know, anything and everything. It was just, you had to do what you can do and make do with what you knew, kind of thing, you know. And that shouldn't be the case of when there is an emergency. You know, it should have been all coordinated and worked out, and you know, it was disorder, there was this chaos, it was, you know, like everyone running around with their hats off, as in, it was so unorganized. There was, nobody knew what they were doing, you know. It was terrible. It was, to say the least, you know.
Did you see anybody wearing an RBKC badge or tabard, like a slip that they put over their shoulders to say who they were, at any stage during that week?
No, I did not see anyone, you know. I was just looking and trying to concentrate for my family at the time.
And if you look down, please, to page 7, sorry, I'm so sorry. Can we go to your first statement? I apologise. IWS 401069, page 7. At paragraph 34 at the foot of your screen, you say this: "This has devastated our lives, as more than half of our family have now died. Life will never be the same, and it is hard to accept. The pain and suffering is unbearable. I don't know if I can ever come to terms and accept what has happened with this ordeal, as the family that we loved and they loved us have gone. I don't wish this ever to happen to anybody else. I'm seeking rehabilitation as a result of what I saw on the night of the fire, as I will never be the same again." Is there anything further Mr. Choucair, is there anything further that you'd like to say to the panel about the impact of the fire on your life, or anything else more generally?
It's totally destroyed our lives. I wouldn't want anyone to go through what we go through. I would gladly swap my shoes to be in a position where I'm not going through what I'm going through, and what we're all having to go through, losing our loved ones. Our lives will never be the same ever again. It's destroyed our families. Rehabilitation, and it's very hard. It's very, you know, it's had a big effect on us. And yeah, I just don't want anyone to go through what we're going through and what we've had to go through.
Well, I'm very sorry. Mr. Choucair, those are all the prepared questions I had for you.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask the chairman to take a break now to see if there's anything that I've missed or that others would like me to put to you. Mr. Chairman, can we do that?
Yes, I think we need to do that. And I think it would be sensible to combine that with the morning break. So we'll stop now. We'll come back, please, at 11:15. And while you're out of the room, I have to ask you, as I have all the other witnesses, not to talk about your evidence to anyone else.
Sure.
All right, and when you come back at 11:15, we'll see if there are any more questions we need to ask you. All right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to go with the usher, please?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. 11:15, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Choucair to come back in, please? Okay. All right, Mr. Choucair.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Choucair, I have no further questions for you other than one, and that is whether you would like to add anything further to the evidence that you've given in your two statements and that you've very helpfully given us this morning.
Yes, there is quite a few things I would like to add. The first thing is that it's been a hell of a journey, that what we're having to go through and what we're going through. It's been forced onto us, what we're having to go through. You can't imagine what we're going through. And, like I said, I wouldn't want it upon anyone else. Second is, in order to get into the inquiry, I was refused the first time in phase 1 3 times. I asked to have a say and I was refused and wasn't allowed. And that shouldn't be the case where one, once as a core participant, needs to say something, and it should be a lot more simple and simplified. That's one of the things. The other thing is on the night in phase 1, on the night of the fire, we was asked, what they would like to see as part of the terms of reference, and we mentioned helicopter, and this wasn't. It was taken into consideration, but it wasn't fully elaborated in phase 1, where the transcripts were read into the inquiry, because on the night my family and many other families relied on the helicopter, and they was hoping that they would be rescued, and I had a few questions I wanted to ask the helicopter pilots who was not available, which I was hoping they would be available, and that was that they were part of the terms of reference, but I never got to ask the helicopter pilots. The transcripts were read into the inquiry, so I never got to, and like many other families, never got to ask the pilots the questions. So we find that we felt left out and lost because it's not something that you ask the questions to your solicitor. It's based upon their reports and what they say, that you ask the questions. And at the time, there was questions I wanted asked about the pilot, and never got the chance to, because it was read into the inquiry. So I felt very let down in that sense. The final thing is part of terms of reference. When they asked and they was inquiring, what would you like to see as part of the terms of reference? We mentioned helicopters. A lot of people mentioned helicopters. A lot of people, because they couldn't understand why people was going up and down and not going out when they should have been going. When they were lower, at the lower ground, they were going up rather than, which we got to find out and understand more later on why this was happening. But, we asked to really, because it was on the night of what happened, the helicopter, but we also asked for institutional discrimination to be looked at. And it's not institutional discrimination when you're looking into discrimination in a report or from what they have said, but looking into and examining it so that you can come and fully understand what people were saying who lived in the tower, our loved ones, what they was fighting for, and understand how they were treated, to really understand. And, this was a crucial part that should have been part of the terms of reference. We had QC, Mr. Imran Khan, who asked yourselves to look into institutional discrimination, and it didn't happen. Then we had Mr. Leslie Thomason, who asked for institutional discrimination to be looked in, because it plays a vital role for what happened. Mr. Chairman and panel members, I, who work with many family members who have lost, and we represent our families, and most of them who died on the night, are asking you all, please, to really look into institutional discrimination, not to come out with a report, but really to examine it as a part of a term of reference. This is the only chance where we have to really fully examine what went wrong and what was going on and what was happening, not to come out with recommendation from the complaints that was given from family members and so, but really to examine it. The same way how we are cross-referencing Lackner House and looking back and saying, oh, if they had sorted it all out at the time, then Grenfell wouldn't have happened. If we have another catastrophe, they will look back at Grenfell Towers inquiry and say, well, you had these recommendations and that was it. That can't be the case. So I'm asking Mr. Chairman and panel members that you really please look into it and have it thoroughly investigated, that this is a crucial part to our families, to have some closure for them, to give them some justice. Recommendations are sometimes not always implemented and not always done. So that's why we need to have institutional discrimination looked at as a part of the terms of reference. We was told that recommendations can be terms of reference can be changed and can be changed later on. Whether that is true or not, and many family members are asking you all to re-look at it and investigate it properly. It's the only chance we have, so we cannot come back and have another inquiry when something goes wrong, when another catastrophe goes wrong, and say that, well, you should have looked at Lackner House so Grenfell wouldn't have happened. But if another catastrophe happens, you don't look back at Grenfell and be blamed for it and say, well, you should have done that recommendation. Not just a recommendation, but you should have thoroughly examined it. We can't have that. We can't go back and keep questioning and keep going back and blaming, well, you should have done that. It has to be done, and it has to be done properly. So I'm asking you, please, to reconsider and to re-look at it so we can have some justice, please. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Choucair, thank you very much for that and for all your evidence. It just remains for me to express our gratitude as an inquiry to you for coming here today and giving us your evidence. So thank you very much.
Yes, and Mr. Choucair, I ought to thank you very much on behalf of not just myself, but all three members of the panel for coming here and giving us your account of things. I think we all understand how difficult it's been for you to do that, and we're sorry to hear how difficult things still are for you and other members of your family. So we're very grateful to you for coming along, and it's been very helpful to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Would you like to go with the usher?
Thank
Free
you
to go,
very
of
much.
course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, there's now going to be some reading in of evidence, and Ms. Islam is going to continue the reading that she paused with in the week.
Good, thank you.
Before we started hearing, or in the middle of hearing the oral evidence, and then there'll be some further material that you will also read in. What I would suggest is that rather than you rising now and then coming back in 3 minutes, I vacate the spot for her and swap over,
Yes.
if you don't mind.
Well, of course, no, we'll sit here happily while you do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Miss Islam. Now you're going to continue the reading that you started the other day, is that right?
I am. And
Thank you.
before I do that, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, can I make one correction? When I was reading from the summary of evidence on the last occasion, I was reading from an extract from the statement of David Lewis, and I said that he was visiting his ex-wife, Mariko Toyoshima Lewis, and their 2 children. I should have said their 3 children. Can I please apologise for that error?
Thank you.
And before I begin the reading, can I reiterate the trigger warning from the last occasion? Some may find hearing about their experiences and the experiences of others in the immediate aftermath as distressing. If anybody would wish to leave the room or pause the live stream, please do so now. Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, you'll remember that we had 8 sections and I managed to complete 6 out of those 8. I'm now going to turn to section 7, dealing with the observations on the response. A number of witnesses have made observations about the adequacy of the emergency relief response, particularly in relation to overarching leadership and coordination of support. Peter John Murphy says, "There was no central structure, no central body taking charge, and no leadership. No one seemed to be working together, nothing was getting done, and it just felt like responsibility kept on being passed around in a never-ending circle." Charlotte McMahon says, "I found the coordination of central government, RBKC, and the TMO in the immediate aftermath of the fire to be non-existent. They were nowhere to be seen. They were silent. They were impossible to contact and had no knowledge when I did speak to them." Simon Jolly says, "On the ground, no one was visibly taking control of or responsibility for coordinating the relief effort. There were so many helpful sites and hubs which volunteers had set up, but they had no means of easily communicating with each other in the immediate aftermath." Some witnesses comment on their interaction with the Prime Minister at the time. Manuel Miguel Ferreira Alves says, "The government did not support us in the immediate aftermath of the fire. I thought that things would change after Theresa May's apology and her promise to rehouse us in 3 weeks, but it all turned out to be a lie." Hiwat Daganachoo lived in flat 26 and says, even the Prime Minister, when she visited, avoided seeing the survivors as though we were contagious. It is beyond comprehension and shows a complete lack of responsibility, compassion, and a complete failure of duty. Emma O'Connor lived in flat 171 and says, it was disappointing that Theresa May failed to meet with the bereaved and survivors in the days following the fire. I was invited to attend 10 Downing Street a couple of months after the fire. However, when we attended, she was out of the country. I felt we were treated with contempt. Contrastingly, Nicholas Burton describes attending a meeting with the Prime Minister at St Clement's Church on Friday the 16th of June. He says, I just got swept into that Friday meeting without really knowing what was going on. People were shouting outside during the meeting because the community was angry that she had not come earlier and met with those affected. I could see why people were unhappy about the way she responded on 15th of June, but for my own part, she seemed sincere and moved when she listened to me talk about my experience. Jason Miller comments on his interaction with Nick Hurd, who was the Minister of State for Policing and the Fire Service at the time. He says, I was speaking to Nick Hurd and he was not paying attention to what I was saying. I felt like he was more of a mouthpiece for RBKC. I had the impression that he was there to sponge information from us, while keeping an ear open for any points of interest to central government and RBKC, as they also had staff present in that meeting. Rashida Ali describes a meeting at the rugby club approximately 4 days after the fire, where members of government attended. She says, the members of government that were taking our information broke down while we were telling them about our situation. The government was simply not equipped to deal with this level of tragedy. They just did not know what to do. Edward Defan, who lived in flat 134, describes meeting Andrea Leadsom, then leader of the House of Commons, at the Rugby Portobello Club on 16th of June. He says, this was the first time I was aware that anyone from central government had spoken to anyone at the RPT. At the meeting, I explained that the fire was preventable. I requested that central government needed to send someone with resources and responsibility to the RPT to take control, because nobody was taking control from the emergency services, central or local government. There is further detail on what we discussed in emails that followed, sent to Andrea on the 17th of June, with a follow-up on the 22nd of June 2017. Leadsom had assured us that she would respond to our requests. However, the emails show that she didn't. Shaheen Saddafi attended a meeting of Gold Command at the Westway Centre on 19th of June 2017, with government representatives in attendance, including Eleanor Kelly, Hilary Patel from DCLG, and others from the Cabinet Office. He says, I sat and listened for over an hour as leaders from charities such as Red Cross introduced themselves and explained what they were doing. As I listened, I became more and more concerned, as it was all so irrelevant and it seemed nobody had any clear sense of priority or leadership or sense of urgency. I felt many in the room were overwhelmed by the number of people affected, and they were all clear that the local council and central government were not doing enough. He continues, finally, I stood up and explained that I was trying to find my neighbours and loved ones from the tower. I asked for help. They simply said, no, this isn't possible. Data protection laws don't allow it. I felt abandoned. These people were supposed to be there to help, but they felt like they were against us. They did not make me feel safer, but seemed like adversaries. The officials did not care. That was how it felt, and I just could not understand their attitude. In relation to the meeting at the Westway Centre, he continues, looking at the meeting as the only Grenfell resident, it appeared they were caught in the headlights and simply did not know how to behave or show any empathy for what people were going through. I appreciate honesty, and if officials such as these are so disconnected from the people they are to serve, then they should remove themselves from such an important responsibility. I felt as if they were hiding behind policies and protocols and yet had no real idea of what was going on or what to do. I explained to the meeting, I've just lost my home, my neighbours, and I've been listening to you for 2 hours, introducing yourselves and explaining how ill-prepared and incapable local and central government has been. There is no sense of priority. I was amazed that government leaders and those that are supposed to plan for major disasters could be so poorly organised and show so little leadership. Particular concerns have been expressed about the absence of RBKC in the immediate aftermath and their failure to offer support. Inez Alves, who lived in flat 105, says, I do not think that RBKC were prepared to respond to what happened, but the community was also not prepared, and yet somehow they managed to provide support faster than RBKC was able to. RBKC should have been quicker. If the community were able to act, why couldn't they? David Andrew Benjamin says, there was a difficult dynamic with many people blaming RBKC for the fire, yet they were now supposed to be supporting those affected. There was a lot of anger and upset over RBKC's invisibility and lack of action immediately after the fire. Leanne Meyer Jackson LeBlanc says, RBKC should have offered a lot more help. Sending social workers and key workers was a cop-out. Existing members of the council, even council managers, should have been sent out, not random key workers. The people that had been in the offices with knowledge of the estate and the community before the fire should have been more involved. They sent people from outside of the area, which caused delay and confusion and doubt, which was avoidable. She goes on to describe the first 7 days as like hell on earth. I didn't know who to speak to, where to go, or what to do. Mohammed Hariri says, RBKC left us to struggle and didn't ever let us feel safe, especially after the fire. Elizabeth Sabiaschak says, there would frequently be representatives of RBKC stationed in the lounge of the hotel. We had lost faith in them from early on anyway, because they were useless and couldn't even deliver their promises, and they couldn't answer anything. We ended up having to beg them, and it took such a long time, and we just felt disregarded again. Noha El Baghdadi says, no one from RBKC or the TMO reached out to me in the first 7 days, or even a few months after the fire. We as a family did not hear from them. It was like they were hiding away from bereaved families, even though some people had lost everything and needed help. They disappeared from us. I expected RBKC and the TMO to reach out, to offer assurance and support, and give us information about where to go to get support and help on how to look for Hisham. Without this support, we had to do things ourselves. This placed added stress on us. A number of witnesses share concerns about the culture within RBKC and how this manifested in the emergency relief response. Benazir Lashari, who was an RBKC Labour councillor at the time of the fire, says, the council were completely incompetent at managing the crisis. There was no procedure in place. It was all chaos. I think that the community are seen by the council and the TMO as simply poor, working-class people in need of social housing, and that we should just be grateful for any and all the help we get. It feels like we are looked down upon by the government and the council. Thomasina Hessel says, there was a real sense of us and them between the authorities and the community at that time. I remember that it seemed like everybody came to North Kensington to support us, but what we didn't have was the council there for us. There were services available eventually, but what people were there from the council were there in such small numbers that we didn't notice them. We later found out that council staff were deployed, but told to hide their ID for their own safety. This illustrates how the council perceive residents as dangerous and a threat. They didn't make their presence felt. I can't tell you what they did in the first 7 days. I understand why RBKC told their staff not to wear council clothes, but this reinforced the perception that they just didn't care. This says a lot about them, and it was this kind of lack of leadership that trickled down from the leader of the council, Nicholas Paget Brown, and Robert Black of the TMO, down to the staff on the ground. The leadership has since been replaced, but a lot of the staff are the same. The culture hasn't changed. If you're not able to see things through other people's eyes, then you shouldn't be in that role. Zakaria Al-Sawi says, "My overwhelming feeling is that the response to the Grenfell tragedy lacked continuity, responsibility, and above all, accountability from our landlords, RBKC, TMO, and other relevant authorities. Information was very slow and inconsistent, and services would be available one day and not the next. We would also have to keep explaining ourselves to the people allocated to assist us as they came and went. This, unlike before, made us feel like we didn't matter and didn't deserve to be treated with dignity. This has caused my physical and mental health to decline significantly at a time when I needed recovery and a space to mourn the loss of those that have passed away in the tragedy. I will never forget the actions of those responsible and will not forgive them for this." Sabide Mine Moradam says, "RBKC did not care about us after the fire, and in fact, at times they were rude and dismissive. I had to get what I needed by force or by fight, and indeed, when I asked for certain things, they told me that they were doing enough and they didn't have to do these things for me. This perfectly sums up the attitude of the council." Hisham Shabika lived in Grenfell Walk. He says, "When I would go to the council to ask for support, they would always make me feel like I was begging. It was humiliating." Farhad Nader says, "We as survivors had no access to those high up in leadership. I remember RBKC organised a meeting, but I was shocked to find out we were only allowed into the gallery area of the town hall, but the meeting was about us. I was initially refused entry as the gallery was already full. I was shocked to see that most of those who had been let in were not even residents of the tower." Ismail Hadgay lived in Testerton Walk. He says, "The RBKC have such power that no one will take action, and the TMO were protected through RBKC. We used to complain, not just me, but the hundreds of people in the community around Grenfell. I think there is a feeling of discrimination, of being underprivileged." In terms of the TMO, Benazir Lashari says, "Overall, the TMO were extremely deficient. I think a lot of the problems came from the fact that they ignored residents. I had known this from some time and experienced it firsthand, and it is why I became a councillor and eventually deputy mayor. I wanted to try and change the way the TMO and RBKC was run, particularly in the way they related and communicated with local people." Jessica Gomez says, "RBKC, TMO, they were very slow. I was angry about how long it took them to come forward. They were nowhere to be found. Their approach was very corporate, very posh. They are not the sort of people to come and talk to us. I think they got that feedback. We did not feel supported. TMO disappeared." Giuseppe Raza says, "During the immediate aftermath of the fire, I never saw anyone from the TMO. They were invisible." Otmain Ben Kawula says, "The TMO were not there immediately after the fire. They should have been the first on the scene at the aftermath, with support and services to care for the residents. The fact that they had no plan or organisational structure to keep residents informed only contributed to the chaos on the scene. The TMO were unprepared for this emergency. I never saw the TMO after the fire. Perhaps they feel guilty about the fire." Turning now to the observations on the community response, a number of witnesses praised the response of the community and charities. Jaime Haymanot Gashor says, "I feel it was the charities and other similar organisations who were the ones who seemed to take on the role of helping survivors, rather than the government and RBKC, who should have been responsible. The charities appeared organised, especially considering the short timescale that they undertook the task of assisting survivors. The charities were there from the very beginning, unlike the government and RBKC." Rauda Saeed says, "It was the voluntary organisations, charities and faith centres that were the first to step up to help survivors of the fire. RBKC and central government were conspicuous by their absence. One of the problems was that they did not have access to the information held by local and central government in terms of those who were resident in the tower, those in hospital, and the ability to ID people. However, despite this, the voluntary organisations, charities and faith centres dealt with us and other survivors with compassion and were as organised as could be expected. Giuseppe Raza says, the support that came from all of the charities and community groups was overwhelming. It was more than enough and great to see. They provided a lot of food and water, provisions, places to stay during the night, and more. Mariam Abdul Qadir Yusuf lived in flat 121. She says, I think the voluntary and community groups were excellent, and I was overwhelmed by their generosity and kindness. It has made us want to be more charitable and help those in need. Michael Sabiaschak says, the generosity of the volunteers and charities never went unnoticed. It was breathtaking. You really see the amazing spirit of people in the aftermath of such a tragedy. Turning now to the last section, dealing with impact, a number of witnesses shared their experiences on the impact of the fire and the impact that that had on their lives. Jenny Faye Kwang says, the Grenfell Tower fire has had a huge impact on me and my family, and on other residents in the community. It has put an immense strain on our personal and working lives, as well as our physical and mental health. At times, this has been copiously overwhelming, and I sincerely hope that we will all recover from this and it won't hurt us for the rest of our lives. Although it is easier to believe that this may have brought some families and the community closer together, it has actually torn some apart. I feel that the trauma experienced by those affected is often underappreciated and forgotten in the system, and it hurts to think that children around the area may always hang on to this suffering. Antonio Roncolato says, the horrifying events from 14th of June 2017 will always stay with me. The fire has turned my son and my lives upside down many times over. There has not been a single day since the fire where I have not had to deal with something connected to it. It is difficult to put into words the pain, upset, and distress that the fire has had upon my son and me. I feel guilty that my son had to watch the tower burn, whilst I was still inside, and that others did not make it out alive. Omar Al-Hajj Ali says, the trauma of the loss of my brother Muhammad, the fire, and the aftermath of the fire have affected me mentally and physically. I lost my home and I lost my beloved brother. Muhammad and I moved to the UK from Syria to be safe. Elsa Afawerki says, the fire at Grenfell Tower had a huge impact on my life, and being in a hotel prolonged the traumatic experience. I still feel the impact, and I'm only now beginning to come to terms with some aspects of what happened. Hestia Gamhi says, I feel broken in pieces. I have changed so much in my mental state and physical health. I keep working, but I just don't function as I used to. I'm trying to find myself again, but it's hard. The grief is overwhelming for all of us. Philip King, a Hurstway Walk resident, says, the night of the fire changed me as a person, and I feel as though I am living in the shadow of the tower. It is the centerpiece of my community, and I have to walk past it every day. Seeing it takes me straight back to the night of the fire, and I feel like I am experiencing it all over again. Marlene Anderson says, this tragedy has left my family with the enormous task of trying to repair and rebuild our lives. My father should never have lost his life in the way in which he did. He was taken from us, and the memory of how my dad lost his life will remain with me forever. My dad was a loving, caring, and gentle soul. He opened his door to many others on the night of the fire, which is testament to his giving, supportive nature. My dad lived in Grenfell Tower for over 30 years of his life. The tower was his home, his sanctuary, and where he sought solace. To the bereaved survivors and residents, we thank you for your courage in sharing your experiences, which have been at the heart of this inquiry. Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, that concludes the evidence to be read from the BSR for Module 4.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Islam. I think there may be other matters to read, is that right?
That is, I'm now going to read a summary of evidence from the community, voluntary and faith sectors.
Right, thank you very much.
There was a significant spontaneous community response in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. As part of the inquiry's investigations, we have spoken to 28 individuals who were involved with the community, voluntary and faith sector response. This has shaped the development of this stream of evidence, and the inquiry has received 24 witness statements relating to this area. The evidence provides an overview of the emergency relief response offered by a number of key organisations that were involved in the immediate aftermath. In due course, we will hear live evidence from the British Red Cross and from 2 community leaders who set up spontaneous rest centres. We will be taking a thematic approach to the evidence to be read and addressing the following 3 themes. Firstly, the community response. Secondly, observations on the official response. And lastly, challenges faced and lessons learned. Turning to the community response first. A number of organisations in the vicinity of Grenfell Tower became heavily involved in the provision of emergency relief on 14th of June and in the days and weeks that followed. Abdul Rahman Saeed is the CEO of the Al-Manar Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Al-Manar opened its doors and offered shelter and sanctuary to all those affected. The response included the provision of food, water, and the distribution of donations, including financial donations through the National Zakat Foundation and the Rugby Portobello Trust. As the fire occurred during Ramadan, Al-Manar was already catering for approximately 300 people every evening. This increased to approximately 600 people per day after the fire. Al-Manar later facilitated a number of services, including counselling, art therapy, and survivors groups. Abdul Rahman Saeed says he was told about the fire by a member of staff in the early hours. He says, "I immediately instructed him to open our doors to anyone who needed help, and I put out a WhatsApp message informing our network that Al-Manar was open to assist survivors. By the early morning, some residents from the tower and surrounding accommodation blocks had arrived at the scene. At one point, there were approximately 100 people in the centre. The staff and volunteers' first actions were to make food and water available to those who needed it." In describing their response, he says, Al-Manar quickly became the centre of efforts to support the local community. Given the fact that Al-Manar is located some distance from Grenfell, it is significant that it became a hub for those seeking help, as well as for those wishing to volunteer their time to support the work of the centre. Al-Manar was well known within the local Muslim community as a place of compassion that would offer help and support. He continues, "Had it not been for the support of the local community, those volunteering, and the generous donations, we would not have been able to support the survivors and residents in the way that we did." Father Gerard Skinner is the Catholic parish priest of Notting Hill. The St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church offered a variety of support to those affected, including food and drink, spiritual and emotional support services, practical assistance such as mobile phone chargers, and the distribution of financial and physical donations. He says that volunteers began arriving at St. Francis Assisi Church at 9 a.m. on the 14th of June, and the church closed at midnight. He says, over the course of the next 2 days, circa 170 volunteers assisted at various times and in various ways. Thousands of donations of every kind arrived continually for the first 2 days. Children brought new toys, adults wheeled suitcases of clothes and toiletries, locals were offering accommodation, financial donations were also received, all of which have been dispersed to former residents of Grenfell Tower and bereaved families from the disaster. In describing the volunteer effort, he says, "The volunteers were from everywhere, of all ages and backgrounds, taking a lead with sorting donations, organising their distribution, and using social media to disseminate information for those who needed help and for those who wanted to help. Our volunteers formed human chains to move boxes of donations. Such was the outpouring of compassion and the horror at the tragedy that had befallen so many. People simply came together as one, united by the need to help." Reverend Michael Long is the minister at Notting Hill Methodist Church. The church provided a base for emergency relief in the first few days following the fire. They were particularly involved in the provision of clothes and toiletries to those from the walkways and Grenfell Walk. The Ascension Trust provided a team of emergency response pastors to the church who assisted in listening to people and calming the atmosphere. Additionally, the church assisted people with making copies of missing posters for those looking for their loved ones. Reverend Michael Long praises the response of spontaneous volunteers. He says, "During Wednesday to Saturday, many volunteers worked in the church sorting goods, attending to residents from the walkways who were in need, and generally helping out. A few particularly dedicated volunteers coordinated emergency clothing, communications, storage, warehousing, and transportation of donated goods under significant pressure, and I remain immensely grateful to them. Volunteers managed to organise themselves and the operation into sections, and the operation was incredibly smooth considering few people knew each other. Volunteers showed immense initiative and resourcefulness. There was a very intense focus to concentrate on the immediate issues and decisions, which were made collaboratively, but also very quickly. Volunteers compiled spreadsheets of volunteer names, skills such as languages spoken, or practical skills that we might need, and also contact details. Jackie Blanchflower was the leader of the Latimer Community Church at the time of the fire. The church provided a safe space, refreshments, and support for people to talk to. A Muslim prayer room was set up within the church for those observing Ramadan. They initiated a memorial wall where people left messages and flowers, which became a focal point for the community. In describing the Latimer Community Church's role, she says, "We had a different role to some of the other places that were offering support. Partly because of our location, people flowed through us. Early on, we made the decision that we did not need to provide beds, as we understood these would be available at the Westway Sports Centre and that other community centres were making provision. We supported some of the bereaved survivors and members of the local community, as well as those coming from outside the area to help." Alison Norman worked for Everyone Active. Through their contract with the Westway Trust, she oversaw the management of the Westway Sports Centre in the immediate aftermath. The Westway Sports Centre started as a spontaneous rest centre and later became the official rest centre. She says, "We agreed that we would open the doors to the sports centre to assist with any residents who may have been displaced by the fire or anything else we could do to assist. I didn't have any contact with the council initially. This was much later that day, around 6 p.m. She continues, "I went onto the streets around the centre and into Latimer Road Church, which was overrun with residents, to tell residents that the sports centre was open and we were serving drinks, food, offering showers and a safe space for those affected." Adrian Clee from the Salvation Army was asked to take the lead role in the response to the Grenfell Tower fire. The Salvation Army is part of the overall voluntary community sector response in London and sits on the voluntary community sector panel, which is part of the London Resilience Forum. He says that the local authority made a request for the Salvation Army Church Centre on Portobello Road to be open as a place of safety on the 14th of June, as the two nearby centres being used were being accessed by the press. He says, "The centre was used in that capacity to give safety and emotional support to a group of around 30 people until partway through Thursday the 15th of June, when activities to support those individuals were consolidated back into the Westway Centre. The Salvation Army in Notting Hill is an integral part of the local community and continued to provide emotional and practical support to those who approached us in the days and months following the fire." Additionally, the Salvation Army was asked by RBKC to assist with the sorting and distributing of new donated goods. They repurposed an empty Salvation Army building and for 4 weeks after the fire, sorted those donations and delivered them to the Westway Centre. Turning now to observations of the official response. In respect of the response and support of RBKC, Abdurrahman Saeed of Al-Manar Mosque says, "On the third day of the fire, we received a visit from some RBKC councillors. During that meeting, I explained to the councillors that we were struggling to cope with the numbers of persons who had become reliant on Al-Manar, the logistical demands of receiving and dispersing the large volume of clothing and other donations, and coordinating activities of volunteers. I asked the councillors to liaise with the RBKC in order to assist the coordination of activities within Al-Manar. We received no such support." He goes on to say that 1 week after the fire, the RBKC Family Services Unit set up a stall in one of our halls to assist Grenfell residents with issues regarding housing and other services. This constituted the only official presence at Al-Manar in the weeks following the fire. In the weeks after the fire. He continues, "In the immediate aftermath of the fire, we received no assistance or support from central government. In respect to the TMO, he says, we received no support or assistance from the TMO after the fire or since." In the weeks following the fire, Abdurrahman Saeed describes being asked to be involved with official meetings attended by representatives of central government, RBKC, the fire brigade and senior police officers. He says, "The representatives of central government, RBKC and the police were utterly underprepared and unable to answer questions put to them or address in a meaningful way the concerns of residents, many of whom were left with the sense that central and local government simply did not care." He continues, "In my opinion, these meetings exposed the catastrophic failure of central and local governments to plan and execute a response to an event like Grenfell." Jackie Blanchflower of Latimer Community Church says, "I do remember seeing some individual people I recognised from the council and TMO. Nicholas Paget Brown was there at one stage. He seemed detached from the situation, and I am not sure if this was because he was in a state of complete trauma and shock, or if he was just there to see that as an organisation receiving funding from RBKC, we were dealing with the disaster appropriately. It was bizarre. He was just standing at the entrance to our building." Judith Blakeman also came. I know her well as she is a long-standing local councillor who has been involved in community issues. I know that other Labour councillors did come and visit, but they were not there as part of an official response, as far as I could tell. She continues, "I was expecting that at some stage someone official would come and tell me what to do. In the afternoon, at about 4 p.m, I think it was a pastor at the Notting Hill Community Church who gave me the number for the RBKC control room. I rang to ask what RBKC wanted us to do. The response was that they had the Westway Sports Centre open and so everyone should just go there. They asked us to shut at 9 p.m. that day to get people off the streets. I thought this at least was sensible and so we closed as requested, probably by about 10 p.m. The next morning I called the control room again. The woman I spoke with told me that we did not need to do anything and did not need to open the church up as everyone could go to the Westway Sports Centre. She simply said that there was no need for us to be open. It was as though I was speaking to someone who had no idea at all what was going on. This was quite early in the morning, and we already had a room full of distressed people. There were people who needed help everywhere. I told her we would be open and did not bother trying to contact them again. By Thursday morning, I thought there would be a plan and anticipated that there would be some sort of briefing, but this still hadn't happened and in fact never did." She continues, "In the first few days after the fire, we received no real help from the authorities. No one from local government offered meaningful assistance until Friday the 16th of June, when two helpful people from the council turned up and asked if we needed any assistance with the storage of donated items. However, by this stage, we had already sourced alternative storage. It felt as though there was a time lag and that the authorities were always behind events, offering help after it was really needed. Father Gerard Skinner says, memories of council involvement are sketchy, not least because there did not seem to be any coherent emergency plan, or if there was one, it seemed not to have been activated. Councillors were certainly walking around the area in groups, including the 2 councillors for Norland Ward, and visited, but my only memory of any attempt at organisation was a council worker who was trying his best to communicate and get answers to questions such as how to handle offers of accommodation, how to distribute or send into storage donations, what services were being organised for victims and where they were based. But the gentleman was not able to provide answers to these questions, despite trying to make contact with RBKC. Reverend Michael Long says, the first few days were a chaotic fog in which little reliable information was available. It was astonishing that in the midst of so much distress and need, there appeared to be no overall coordination of provision other than for the survivors at the Westway Centre. It was hard to find out information about those who were injured or missing. In terms of official support made available to the Westway Sports Centre, Alison Norman says, I don't recall any support being offered in the initial hours or first day. After the first visit by the TMO in the mid-afternoon, RBKC arrived early evening to give us an update on what was happening and to discuss the possibility of keeping the centre open overnight, which of course we were expecting to do anyway. There was some presence by the TMO and RBKC from early evening. They started to work with us to try and coordinate the centre, but the reality was this took a few days. It felt like we were on our own until that point. In terms of when the Westway Centre was designated the official rest centre, Alice Norman says, I think it was a few days after the fire. I was informed by RBKC that's what would be happening. I was not involved in any consultation. I was happy to support where we could, but it was a huge strain on my team, physically and emotionally, and felt a bit bulldozered at times, but it was a difficult situation for all. I was desperate for my team to have a break, but this was not possible. I never felt that the sports centre was the right location for those who had been bereaved or traumatised, and raised this point on a number of occasions. She continues, I don't think the sleeping arrangements were at all suitable. No consideration seemed to have been given to the trauma that residents had been through. Residents were sleeping on mats and donated mattresses in the tennis hall floor. It was upsetting. In respect of the management of the centre, she says, RBKC had a rota of cover along with other authorities. Some were better than others. Sometimes it felt like we were going backwards when authorities changed over duty. She continues about the coordination and leadership of the centre and says, initially the leadership and coordination was appalling, but after a few days things improved. One particular concern that she raises was not having enough staff or expertise. Valerie Patterson was the head of learning and skills at the Westway Trust. Although the Westway Trust was not responsible for the management of the sports centre, which was sublet to everyone active, the Westway Trust offered support to the local community in the days and months that followed the fire. She raises concerns about the lack of clarity about what support was available. She says, there was no one that was making clear what people were entitled to. When individuals turned up, unless they were quite forceful, some were not receiving the necessary support. There were a number of cases that needed strong advocacy. We became aware of people sleeping in cars or in local gardens, and our workers supported them to access support. She raises concerns about some of the processes at the Westway Centre. Some of the staff were very empathetic, but others were not, and the experience for deeply traumatised people could feel like a purely bureaucratic form-filling process. Some people went over and beyond, but others were very matter-of-fact. There was an over-reliance on emailing. For example, one person who had lost 5 people was told to send an email, when what was really needed was for someone to sit with that person, listen, and perhaps work with him to send the email. She continues, the Westway Trust received no direct support from central or local government, nor from the TMO. It took significant time before any level of coordination was set up. Local organisations and local residents were able to respond on the ground quickly. This helped in terms of the immediate relief. However, there was no central communication and coordination, which led to considerable confusion for bereaved and survivors. Dr. Alan Everett was the vicar of St Clement Nottingdale and St James Norlands. He says, at no point in those first few days was I aware of any significant coordination from central government, RBKC and the TMO. Those traumatised by the fire were badly failed. Turning now to the key challenges that were experienced and lessons to be learned, a number of witnesses say that their organisation did not have a pre-agreed plan with RBKC in the event of an emergency, nor were they aware of RBKC's emergency plan. Jackie Blanchflower from the Latimer Community Church says, a major question that remains in my mind is, what was the disaster response plan? I always thought there must be a plan. Given that there is a terrorist threat in this city, I assumed that someone must have thought about the response to a major event like this. However, it quickly became clear that there was no contingency planning that covered anything of this scale. I look back and I wonder whether, as the leader at a community centre, I should have been contacting the council before the fire to ask what the plan was, but I assumed that they would contact us if they thought we might be needed as part of a disaster response. A serious but small-scale incident a few years before had led to the police using our building to provide support to local residents affected. So it was clearly not that we were an unknown organisation. It was this that I found particularly hard. I was waiting for someone to tell me what to do, expecting to be a part of a coordinated plan, but instead we were left to try and support people as best we could with what resources we could gather. Similarly, Father Gerard Skinner says that the emergency response of St Francis Assisi Church was not part of the official response. We became involved as part of the spontaneous outpouring of compassion as we wanted to help in any way that we could. We had no pre-existing plan or agreement with RBKC for emergencies such as the Grenfell Tower fire. Witnesses also reflect on the need for a disaster management plan that is properly rehearsed. Alison Norman from Everyone Active says, there should be a rehearsed response to major disasters. One agency should coordinate. There should be a documented plan that can be adapted. It took too long for a council response to emerge. The Red Cross should have been engaged instantly. They told me they can't unless instructed to do so in these situations. Reverend Mark O'Donoghue, the area dean of Kensington at the time of the fire, describes a meeting with community leaders on the 20th of June and says, I tried calmly to explain that the difficulty was that a disaster response plan had not been created by RBKC for anything more than a bus crash on the high street, and that the community organisations had not been consulted on any such disaster response plan. In such a disaster, it was always the community groups, as on this occasion, who opened their doors and turned on their kettles and began offering relief, and so going forward it would be a benefit to RBKC to involve the community groups. Witnesses emphasised the need for personnel involved in emergency response to be properly trained. Valerie Patterson from the Westway Trust says, workers were brought in from other areas of the council or different boroughs that would have had very different roles in their substantive post. They were put in a very difficult position when supporting traumatised bereaved and survivors, and neither they nor bereaved and survivors benefited from this position. There should be designated emergency support personnel identified in every council to step in for emergencies to ensure those affected receive an empathetic, appropriate response. Adrian Clee from the Salvation Army describes there being one individual from RBKC who was sent to the Salvation Army on Portobello Road. He says, The individual sent along had no training or experience of rest centres or emergency support and was clearly totally out of her depth. She was unable to give a lead or to answer any questions we had. She also struggled to readily link us to anyone else within the local authority who could answer important questions, i.e., was any accommodation being arranged for those who were at our centre and who had been displaced by the fire. He continues talking about the availability of trained personnel to take the lead at rest centres and says, in terms of a learning going forward, I would reflect that this needs to be a priority for situations where it may be the case that more than one rest centre is required. There was a lack of information relating to support services available and an absence of information for the bereaved. Father Gerard Skinner says the biggest organisational challenge was discovering from official sources what services were available to help us help those who most needed help and communicating with other relief centres. The second biggest challenge was the sheer volume of donations that poured into the church and parish centre. A further great challenge was discovering contact details of bereaved relatives to offer support. Jackie Blanchflower says, when I arrived, Latimer was packed with a whole mixture of people. Some were survivors, others were people searching for loved ones, as well as local residents who were shocked and appalled by what they had witnessed. It was particularly distressing that people could not access information about who had come from the tower, so they were searching, not knowing if their loved ones were still in the fire, in hospital, or safe somewhere. In the early period after the fire, it was very difficult to know where to go and look for people who were missing. We were struggling to get accurate information ourselves about which community centres, churches, and other faith groups were providing support. What information we did have was all obtained through word of mouth, and the situation was constantly changing. It seemed as if the emergency services had not set up an immediate place of refuge, and that the council spent so long setting up the Westway Sports Centre as a relief centre that by the time it opened, many people had already dispersed. In those first few hours, people were left to find help for themselves, as the authorities were slow to respond to their immediate needs. To fill the gap, they turned to the voluntary and faith sector, and to organisations they trusted or were directed towards by those out in the street watching events unfold. In terms of what may have assisted, Jackie Blanchflower says, someone from the council should have come on the first morning to assess what was happening and then briefed us and other organisations accordingly. It seemed clear to me that the authorities can access support and information in a more coherent and coordinated way, and so could have provided strategic input early on. Instead, chaos ensued, and the voluntary and faith sector, as well as individual volunteers, stepped up to fill the gap. Witnesses say that there is a need for better coordination and oversight. Jackie Blanchflower said in relation to this, the lack of official involvement and oversight in the first day led to a power vacuum, which was, I think, very unhelpful for the community and its recovery. It is important that people are directly involved in the relief effort, but proper coordination and oversight is vital. As no one was taking control, it was anarchic, and many people did things spontaneously, following their own initiative. In the short term, this was fine, but the long-term consequences were sometimes not so beneficial. I am not an expert, and it is complicated, but while it is vital that the authorities engage with and listen to the community, it is also very important that there is direction to the work that is done. There was so much more that could have been done by the authorities. Better planning and a more prompt and coordinated response could have mitigated more of the effects of the disaster than the hands-off approach that we witnessed. She also reflects on the need for organisations on the ground to be coordinating with each other. She says, initially there was a disconnection between the various centres offering emergency provision. One thing we found particularly helpful was when an individual on their own initiative went round to the various centres involved in the relief work and made sure that each centre knew about the others and ensured that we all had each other's contact numbers. This was brilliant as it enabled us to better understand what was available elsewhere and to work in a more coordinated way. It was just one guy on a bike, but it was the most effective external coordination that we received. As brilliant as it was that he did this, I would have thought that there should have been a central or local government plan in place even before the fire happened, so that voluntary agencies could be involved in an appropriate and coordinated way. I felt that our disaster response was powered by WhatsApp and post-it notes. Reverend Michael Long says, "What we needed and I expected was a visible presence of RBKC staff to provide clarity of information principally and be a point of communication secondarily. Although some RBKC councillors were present in the streets by the church in the first few days, what was required was something far more tangible and visible. People wearing identifying insignia or high-vis jackets, equipped with notebooks, clipboards, communication with others, etc. Without this, we felt abandoned without information and support. At no stage did anyone approach us in any official capacity to ask what we were doing, if we needed support or assistance." Abdul Rahman Saeed describes the importance of recognising the needs of diverse communities. He says, "On 14th of June 2017, Al-Manar found itself at the centre of a relief effort for bereaved and traumatised families and residents. We were unprepared for the human tragedy that arrived at our doors on the morning of the fire and in the days and weeks that followed. I am proud of the fact that with our limited resources, we managed to ameliorate some of the suffering. I wish we could have done more. I share the frustration of many in the community who feel that both central and local government were absent at a time when they were needed most. The support that came was often too little and too late. Whilst I recognise that Grenfell was a tragedy of catastrophic proportions, more could have been done to prepare for and meet the obvious and immediate needs of displaced residents and those affected. There should have been better coordination between central and local government and those organisations on the ground, such as Al-Manar, that were addressing immediate needs of residents. At the centre of the Grenfell tragedy is a community diverse in terms of religion, ethnicity and culture. There was a failure by central and local government to recognise that such communities might react differently to other communities when faced with such acute adversity. A failure to recognise the importance of religious and cultural norms within those communities, and a failure to recognise the resources that were available within the community, including adopting a community-led response to the tragedy. He also highlights wider cultural needs and says, "The need for a counselling service became apparent in the week after the fire, when some parents expressed concern about the emotional well-being of their children. It became apparent that there was an absence of faith and culturally sensitive counselling available to these families, particularly having regard to the diversity of the communities and the variety of languages spoken within the community." Andrew Langford was the lead major incident responder for Crew's bereavement care at the time of the fire. He says that whilst the overall response to the incident improved during the Humanitarian Assistance Group meeting on the 20th of June 2017, upon reflection, the response to the incident was a general one, and there was no overt indication of the group taking into account any issues relating to equality, diversity and inclusion. In retrospect, this could have been cited and a specific analysis undertaken relating to the specific needs of prevalent groups. Andrew Langford describes that initially Crews was not invited into the Humanitarian Assistance Centre, the Westway Centre, until they spoke to the lead responder at the British Red Cross. He says, This meant that people were not able to access the de-traumatising support that our organisation could and has in the past provided as a response to other major incidents, including 7/7, 9/11, the Borough Market attack in 2017, and also the Manchester bombing in 2017. He says there was a distinct lack of psychological support immediately following the incident for those directly involved. The focus was very much on catering for immediate physical needs, which is entirely understandable. However, if more engagement with the voluntary sector and statutory health resources took place sooner, this could have further minimised the negative psychological impact to those affected. Furthermore, there was variable support for the key link workers involved in supporting those affected by the fire. Crews offered such support in the Humanitarian Assistance Group meeting on the 20th of June. However, this was not taken up. More short-term psychological interventions, de-traumatising and debriefing could have contributed to minimising immediate distress and the impact of traumatic memories that surfaced later on. He continues, the understanding of the full psychological impact of an incident, such as the Grenfell Tower fire, needs to be more fully understood and held by local authorities, commissioning services to support people following a major incident. Some brief support could have been provided by crews and other organisations to those most affected. It is our considered belief that this would have reduced the amount of trauma experienced later that we saw emerging at the Friends and Family Assistance Centre some weeks after the incident. A number of witnesses describe how the numbers of volunteers and volume of donations presented a challenge. Abdul Rahman Saeed says, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, we were contacted by many people who wanted to volunteer their time supporting the work of the centre. There were numerous volunteers, but we did not have the capacity or the time to log details due to being overwhelmed with the needs of the community and the need to meet those needs. Many of the volunteers were persons from outside of the community. This raised obvious safeguarding concerns, particularly given those volunteers were in contact with children and vulnerable adults. However, without their support, Al-Manar would not have been able to provide the support it did in the critical days after the fire. Jackie Blanchflower says, one conclusion I would draw is that as an organisation, it is really helpful when you have volunteers that you already know. It was very helpful when other churches contacted us with people who wanted to help because we knew that any volunteers they provided would come with a degree of pre-vetting, and so we could accept them with a higher degree of trust. That is not to say that ordinary spontaneous volunteers were not very useful at times. There needs to be a whole piece of public education on responding to a disaster in terms of effective volunteering and appropriate donations. The public outpouring of grief and shock is really important, and I would not dismiss how important it is that people are involved, but there are unintended consequences. Donations are important, but there are specific things that were needed, and not just general second-hand things. We had the logistical problem of storing items and then getting rid of unsuitable donations. Andrew Langford highlights the importance of utilising the voluntary sector and local community groups. Referring to the Humanitarian Assistance Group meetings, he says, the early coordination meetings on the 15th, 16th and 17th of June 2017 seemed to demonstrate that there was an unsureness on the part of the local authority as to what the official voluntary sector partners and the wider community could offer in terms of support. A clear understanding of what the voluntary sector could offer at an earlier stage by the local authority would have, in Cruz's view, hastened further support to people affected by the incident. There needed to be more of an understanding about how the voluntary sector could be utilised in order to assist the relief effort. Further understanding of how local authorities can engage local community groups and resources will be useful. There was much capacity to support people affected through local community groups. However, there seemed to be no links between the local authority and those community groups in the North Kensington area. it would have been beneficial for there to be a protocol or mutual aid agreement in place between community organisations to support should there be such an event. Luke Jonathan Miller is the Archdeacon of London, as well as Resilience Lead for the Diocese of London. He is a member of the London Resilience Forum and chair of the Faith Sector Panel. He says, curating relationships before you need them and ensuring that there are good local links increases community resilience very considerably. Building into the protocols for a strategic coordination group that the faith and belief sector should be engaged, and ensuring it is also drawn into the humanitarian assistance in the recovery phase is important. The faith and belief sector can be effectively supported by regional and local government, but its inherently bottom-up, devolved and diverse nature means that it cannot easily be managed through policies, procedures, or uniform methods of working. It is, above all, about relationships at each level of the life of our communities. Adrian Cleave from the Salvation Army says, one key gap prior to 2017 was the level of engagement with the voluntary community sector at a local resilience forum and local authority level. Some local resilience forums were heavily engaged with their voluntary community sector partners, with strong relationships, mutual understanding, and genuine partnership, working in responses to major incidents. Other local resilience forums were very much content to pay lip service to the role of the voluntary community sector, with the role of non-professionals being very much an afterthought. The various tragic events in 2017 have made a difference to the engagement with the voluntary community sector by statutory partners, which will be helpful in future emergencies. But there is still some way to go before this approach is across the board and the voluntary community sector is truly viewed as a trusted partner. He continues in terms of learning for the voluntary community sector itself. There has been genuine reflection and action with regard to bridging the gap between the response from the main voluntary community sector national responding charities, such as the Red Cross and Salvation Army, and the myriad of support available from local churches, faith and community groups. I believe that the Civil Contingencies Act needs to be strengthened to make it a requirement for Category 1 responders, local resilience forums, to involve the voluntary community sector in their emergency planning and exercising. The Act currently just says they must pay due regard to the voluntary sector and the role that it can play in responding to emergencies. As a result, there is not a consistent approach across the country within local resilience forums or local authorities. Some are examples of best practice in terms of engagement, some are very poor. The voluntary community sector itself can continue to advocate for more engagement, but unless involvement in the local resilience forums and local authority emergency planning process is mandated, there will continue to be an inconsistent picture across the country. He states the need for much more of a person-centred rather than task-orientated approach to the humanitarian aspects of an emergency response is key, as having full an understanding of the richness, diversity, capacity, and characteristics of whichever community has been affected. These elements are firmly embedded in the voluntary community sector approach to responding to future major incidents. Turning lastly to final reflections, Reverend Mark O'Donoghue says, amidst the anguish, anxiety, and suffering on that first day, there were some remarkably encouraging signs. Many have remarked on the phenomenal outpouring of compassion in the days following the fire. Churches, gurudwaras, mosques, and synagogues, including my friends at Al Manar Mosque and the Holland Park Synagogue, and also other community groups such as the Harrow Club and the Rugby Portobello Trust, threw open their doors to help those affected. Nor was the compassion confined to the community of Kensington. People came from all over London and across the UK, arrived with offers of help and supplies. It is hard for local churches and faith groups to feel like we can do much to lift the burden of grief in tragedies such as Grenfell. But we committed to walk alongside the community of North Kensington, to pray with them and for them, and to share their burden as best we could. We were equally committed to being critical friends of those in power, seeking honest answers and a transparent process that keeps the survivors and the community at the heart of it, holding all to fulfil their promises and seeking the will from all sides to rebuild the trust and rebuild the community. William Wake, who struggled to sleep that first week, told the Prime Minister that if it wasn't for the churches, they would have been utterly abandoned. Nicholas Burton, who escaped from the 19th floor, ended one meeting by telling us that although he was homeless, he was no longer hopeless. Mr. Chairman, members of the panel, that concludes the evidence to be read from this portion of the evidence.
Ms. Islam, thank you very much. Now, we have another witness today, don't we? But I think she's scheduled to be here at 2:00. Is that right?
That's right.
In which case, I think we'll have to rise at this point, and we'll sit again at 2:00.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much.